Hello, in this video I'll show you how to make gluten-free tortellinis from scratch. I always start my tortellini recipes by making the filling first. So in a bowl I'm going to combine 8 ounces of ricotta, 1 egg at room temperature, half a cup of Parmesan, half a teaspoon of salt, and 1 teaspoon of dried basil. The reason I always make the filling first is because the gluten-free pasta dough tends to dry pretty quickly, and I don't want any of the tortellini rounds to dry while I'm making this filling. So I make this and I set it in the fridge until I'm ready to fill my tortellinis. Now I make my pasta dough by adding 1 1/4 cup of flour and 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm using Bob's Red Mill gluten-free 1-to-1 baking flour, and I'm also using the spoon and level method to scoop the flour into my measuring device and level it off before adding it into the bowl. After I've whisked the salt and flour together to make sure it's evenly distributed, I create a well in the flour by using the back of one of my measuring devices. Then into this well I add 2 eggs at room temperature and 1 tablespoon of olive oil. With a fork I beat the eggs and combine it with the olive oil until it's smooth, and then I start bringing in some flour from around the edges of the well. Then I stir all of the dough together and start kneading it. It's really important to use eggs at room temperature for this, because eggs at room temperature combine a lot better and a lot easier than eggs that have been cold from sitting in the fridge. If needed, I'll add warm water to the dough to combine everything together. I add this in increments of 1 tablespoon at a time. Sometimes it's difficult to know how much water you might need to add, just based on how much moisture was in the eggs that you used. The dough shouldn't have so much moisture in it that it sticks to your hands, but it shouldn't be so dry that it crumbles. The dough should be nice and smooth. One benefit of making gluten-free pasta noodles is that you don't have to worry about making the dough too tough. This toughness can be caused in noodles with gluten in them because the gluten protein can overdevelop. But since there's no gluten in this, you can knead the dough until it reaches the consistency that you like. I do tend to make my tortellini dough a little bit on the wetter side just because I'm going to be shaping the pasta dough and I know that it tends to dry fast. But we can also add more flour to this as we're rolling it out just in case it's too wet. Once the dough is fully kneaded, I lightly flour the top and bottom and then place it in some plastic wrap to put in the fridge to chill for at least 30 minutes before we roll it out. Once the dough has chilled, I divide it into 6 equal sections. Again, I'm using smaller sections here because the tortellini dough can dry out faster since we're doing shaping and filling. I take one of the sections out and wrap the other 5 back up and put them back into the fridge. I use the Schul pasta maker. This is a manual machine that uses a crank to roll out the dough to the desired thickness. I set the pasta machine to the widest setting that's available, but I still need to flatten the pasta dough before putting it into the machine. If you don't have the pasta dough thin enough before it goes into the machine, then it will actually tear and not go through smoothly. So I start flattening this section of dough until it's thin enough that it will fit into the pasta maker. I also add some flour to the top and to the bottom of the pasta dough before I put it into the pasta maker. This will help with any sticking while it goes through the machine. Then I feed the pasta dough into my pasta maker. I hold it with my left hand while I crank the machine with my right. You can see it puts out a thinner sheet of pasta dough. You can see that the dough is sticking to itself and that it's kind of feathered and peeled up. This means that it's still a little bit too wet, so I'm adding some flour onto the different surfaces and then doing a letter fold, which is folding it on itself 3 times. And again, still putting some flour on the top and bottom of the pasta. Then I run this through the machine again. I try to always put the pasta dough through the pasta maker with the folded ends on the sides. This way, every time that I'm running the pasta through the machine, it's rotated by 90 degrees, which helps with an even distribution of the flour that I'm adding to the dough. You can see here that the dough is still too wet. It's sticking to itself, which actually caused a tear in the middle. This isn't a problem because we can just continue reworking the dough until it's to the desired texture and consistency that we need. This is one of the great benefits of making gluten-free pasta instead of making a pasta with gluten in it. Because there's no gluten in this dough, we don't have to worry about overworking it and creating a tough dough. So I repeat the same process again of applying flour to multiple sides of the dough and using a letter fold to fold it on itself. And then I run it through the pasta machine again, still making sure that the folded ends are on the left and the right sides. The dough came out this time with some jagged edges, which is to be expected because the last time we did a fold it had a tear in the center of it. But it's much closer to the texture and consistency that I need, so I fold it up again, and this time I'm only applying flour to the top and bottom of the dough. Then again I run it through the pasta maker, making sure that the folded sides are on the left and right. I'm also still pressing the dough flat by hand to make sure that it's thin enough to go into the pasta maker. I keep continuing this process over and over until I get this section of dough to the right consistency. This is the very first section that I'm working with out of all of the pasta dough, with the 5 remaining sections still in the fridge. So it's not uncommon or unusual that the first section I work with, I have to add the most amount of flour to because it hasn't dried out as much as the very last section that I'll work with does. Again, if I was making a different dough, such as rolling these out just for lasagna noodles, I wouldn't have made the dough quite as wet, but I need to make sure that the very last section I work with is still manageable. I wanted to show shaping the very first section of pasta dough for exactly this reason. This way I can show that it can take a little bit of time to get your dough just right, but because we're doing gluten-free flour and it won't become a tough dough, it's fine to take that time. Now the dough looks really nice and has a great consistency, so I'm going to fold it and check the size to make sure that I can get an appropriately sized tortellini out. This will be the final fold that I do on this piece of pasta dough. The purpose of this fold is only to get an accurately sized tortellini. I feed the dough through the machine again, still making sure that the folded sides are on the left and the right. And I'm still using the widest setting for my pasta maker. So I'm going to lay the dough out and I'm going to brush flour just on the top. And this will help to make the pasta dough thin out when I run it through on a thinner setting. So I drop my pasta machine down by 1 setting and run it through again. These settings aren't always the same on different pasta makers, so I'm thinning this dough out to just about 2 millimeters thin. Once I have this dough through, I'm going to lay it down on the parchment paper again and cut out the tortellini shapes with a round cookie cutter. I try to fit as many tortellini rounds onto this sheet of pasta as I can, and then I'll remove any of the leftover pasta dough and combine it with another section that I'll make later. Now I fill each of the tortellini rounds with 1/4 teaspoon of the ricotta cheese mixture that we made earlier. I'm placing this on the lower half of the tortellini round. Then I apply some water around the edges of the tortellini round to help make the pasta stick to itself. I only apply the water one at a time. Then I fold the tortellini in half over the cheese mixture and press down on the dough, leaving about a 1/4 inch open on each side. Then I press into the very middle of the tortellini and pull the 2 corners together. Finally, I press the edges of the dough all the way around just to make sure that it's secure. Now I repeat this with the other tortellini rounds. It's important not to use more than a 1/4 teaspoon of filling in each one of the tortellini rounds, otherwise they'll be really difficult to close and seal, and it's likely to burst open when you cook it. Now that I have those 3 made, I'm picking up the pasta dough that I had discarded from around those 3 cutouts, and I'm going to go ahead and roll this back out now. One benefit of rolling this dough out now is that we already know the consistency is right, so the only thing we have to get right now is just the width and the thickness. I make sure to set my pasta maker back to the widest setting, and then once I have that rolled out to the width that fits my cookie cutter, then I go back down to 1 less than the widest setting. Now I lay the dough out flat, and I'm able to get 2 more tortellini rounds from this one. Once you have your gluten-free tortellinis made, you can use them in any pasta dish that uses traditional tortellinis. One thing I have noticed is that the gluten-free flour does tend to create a little more starch in the pasta water, and this can cause any of your pasta sauces to thicken a little bit more than they would if you were using flour that had gluten in it. This recipe will make just about 30 tortellinis. You can cook these fresh, just boil them for 6 to 7 minutes, or you can freeze these to cook at a later date. If you cook these from frozen, you'll want to cook them for at least 10 to 11 minutes in boiling water. And here we have our homemade gluten-free tortellinis. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out the video linked below to see how to make my garlic butter and sausage tortellini dish. Let me know how it works out for you in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.